Good afternoon. My name is Jayjock. Today I'm going to talk about continuous manufacturing for new product for new drug product development. When I was asked to talk about this, I was basically proposed three questions. The questions were one, what's the problem? Two, what's the solution? And then three, how does Patheon do that? Right. So this is an emerging technology, which means that it's something that's not out in the market quite yet, but we're working on it and working to get it out there pretty quickly. I'm going to stand on this side. Okay, so if you have a challenge in the pharmaceutical industry, small molecule usually, but you're trying to make a tablet or a capsule, and you have a new drug product, and you have one or more of the three attributes, continuous manufacturing is perfectly suited for your product. The one would be that the new drug substance is expensive, and this is a big one. Most of our new drug substances are very expensive on a per kg basis. Second one is that if you're doing something like a breakthrough therapy, and the third one is if that formulation is giving you problems, particularly when it comes to stability regarding segregation. So I'm going to go through and talk about these in a little more detail. So when you think about the cost of a new drug product in development, you break it down, you got to go through several different scales of development and production that never go in a patient, that are just there to get engineering data and understand what a product is doing. So you got the pilot scale, which is somewhere between 1 to 5 kgs. You got R&D scale 1 to 5 kgs. Pilot scale is something like 15 to 30 kg, and then you go to your first manufacturing scale, somewhere between 150, 300, and then again another bump, optionally 300 to 600 kgs. Let's just take a mean number in all those things, kind of a typical scale-up scenario, and then say how many experiments I'm going to do at each stage. Well, in the QBD age that we're in now, you'd end up doing somewhere around 30 experiments R&D. It's about 90 kgs of material, 12 in pilot, 6 and 6 in the scale up. When you look at the costs start really adding up. And again, this is material that never actually goes into a human. It's not material for a trial. It's material solely used to characterize the process. So what you see is that it actually ends up being backloaded, where you go from in the hundreds of thousands up into the millions of dollars pretty quickly as you're going through scale up in order to get to starting the manufacturing. On the breakthrough therapy sides, about 2012, the FDA passed the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, and part of that was to designate breakthrough therapies. And these would be therapies that would be brought to the market on a much more expedited basis. Since 2013, there have been 49 drugs have been tagged with this label. And what companies are finding out is that the thing that's holding them up and getting through the breakthrough therapy is actually the development of their process. It's no longer the clinical trials, because the clinical trials are on a much shorter time. So breakthrough therapies is one example of a product where you could say it's definitely on a fast track. And there's other ways in which the development timeline is shortening. So the last point I talked about was kind of a technical one. I'll go into a little bit more technical detail here, but I'll try not to bore everybody out. So if you think about segregation in a process, you think about what the actual mechanic is that runs it. If you, let's just say, are doing any unit operation, this is going to be a batch transfer where you have material in in a container and you want to put it in another container. You pull out a valve, you open up a valve, material starts flowing, air has to be displaced, air ends up running up. And what this ends up doing, this means that air interacts with the bed, and it preferentially entrains the small particles because they're more sensitive to the air. After a while, the rate at which that entrainment happens stabilizes out, and you end up with what's called a steady state. At the end then, you have this high concentration up in that thing where those fine particles then fall out of the air. What you get then is you get fine particles coming out of the end. And this is classic segregation that we see all over our batch things, where we see high concentration or low, depending on what's segregating in the beginning. It normalizes out, and then in the end we have a segregation issue again. So I'm going to come back at the end and touch base on segregation and why it's different in a continuous manufacturing sense after we go through and talk about what is continuous manufacturing, the solution to these three things. In continuous manufacturing, there is this advantage that we don't have in batch, which is that you can really scrutinize the scale of the process using much less, scrutinize a manufacturing scale process using much less material, kind of like pilot scale quantities that you normally do in the batch world. This would be, also you can run your trials much quicker. It takes you a day to run the entire manufacturing suite to get clinical product, whereas usually it'll take 2 to 6 weeks worth of time when it's fast. And it eliminates the need for scale up between pilot and manufacturing batches. And we'll go back and talk about that. But those last 3 steps are really just scaling up from where you did your clinical batches to where you go into manufacturing. That gets eliminated because you've already tested your manufacturing process earlier on. So I'm going to take a pause here. I'm going to step back and talk about what is continuous manufacturing, because it's an important thing, and then I'll go a little bit technically into what it is. Continuous manufacturing gets confusing nowadays because there's 3 different terminologies that people talk about, and they use them interchangeably, and they're not. One is continuous production, the other one is continuous process, and the other one is continuous manufacturing. Continuous production is striving to use your plant's capacity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is the way we actually run a lot of the pharmaceutical plants, if not most of them today. So that's not what we're talking about when we say continuous manufacturing. A continuous process is a process in which material is being fed in, processed, and fed out all at the same time. This is in contrast to a batch process where material is dropped in, processed, and then dropped out again. Now, the interesting thing is there's 2 filings for continuous manufacturing already, 2 products on the market. One is Janssen's Persista, and the other one's or can be for Vertex. Neither one of these would actually apply for this, would actually fall under this definition. Janssen has a batch coater at the end, and Orkambi uses a batch dryer in the middle of it. So if continuous production and continuous process, which have already been defined, are not continuous manufacturing, what is continuous manufacturing? So I got a picture of a Krispy Kreme line there because that is actually a great example of continuous manufacturing. But the definition is one that we've kind of come up with, we've hobbled together out of what the benefits that we see of this new approach are in continuous manufacturing world. The first is that the definition amount of material that you produce at any one time is no longer tied to the scale of your equipment. So in the batch world, I have a train, I say, okay, there's my blender, it's got 300 kgs of material, that material is all part of my batch. Nowadays in continuous manufacturing, it's more like water flowing through a pipe. It's not the size of your water tank, it's how fast and how long you run water through that tank. So it's not inherently set by the scale of the equipment. If you want to make 100 kilograms, you can run for a couple hours. If you want to make 1,000 kilograms, you can run for 10 times that amount of time. Second one, and this is the important one from the process capability point of view, is that the ability exists, if necessary, to divide feed-forward and feedback control loops, which span across unit operations. So in the batch world, usually our control strategy is based around doing the same thing every time. But we live in a world where things vary. Incoming material property attributes vary. Environmental factors vary as you're running them. And so we do have this problem in pharma where we end up having a lot of rejected material that fails because of natural variability with a product with a process that's not particularly flexible. What continuous manufacturing will let us do is, since the donuts are coming out right there, but they're also being cooked just a few minutes later before, if you start to see a problem with your donuts down the stream, you can go back and you can adjust the temperature in the oven or the temperature in the fryer or whatever the case is. It gives you that ability to actually update your control in real time, monitor your process from across the entire process while you're running. This is all based out of an article that I wrote with a colleague of mine on what is continuous manufacturing and pharmaceutical online. If people are interested, I suggest you take a look. I think it did a pretty good job of outlining the space. So what does a continuous manufacturing line look like, right? How do they work? What's the anatomy of one? So this is Rutgers University built a prototype in 2012 of a continuous manufacturing line for one of their collaborators, and this is the 3D CAD model of that. So this down here is a standard tablet press. So this is about 6 feet tall. This is a process that takes up 3 stories. This one. This was a top floor with feeders, middle floor with blending, and a bottom floor with a tablet press. But yet all of the equipment relatively small in one stack up, right? Starts off with loss and weight feedings. Loss and weight feeders. Their whole job is just to supply the process with material at a fixed rate according to the ratio of that material in the formulation. After that, it goes to continuous blending. As the material's coming in, it's being continuously blended in order to assure content uniformity, and then it drops off into a compression machine. Now, there's no reason that you couldn't drop an encapsulator in that same place. They both need powder to be fed in order to produce products. So, as I said, as I alluded to earlier, this means that this arrangement of equipment means that we can interrogate it actually with a lot less equipment than what we typically do in the batch world. I'm going to talk about how that works now. If we make a change anywhere within the continuous manufacturing process, let's just say I throw some material in there right there that's going to change the concentration, and then I look at the exit, and I wait, and I'm monitoring that exit for that material. After some time, I will see that material come through. And actually on this graph, you can see about a minute later this comes through. And that's about true for a tablet press. If you throw something right on top of a tablet press, about a minute later you see a wave come out just like that. But what this really means is that any change, intentionally or unintentionally, change in material property or change in or straight up change in the in process parameter, we can see the effect of going down the line in real time. We can wait for that change to go all the way through, and it's like you did a little experiment, right? So in development, what we do is we set up our line. We say, okay, we're going to test 3 different formulations. We're going to do different compression speeds, and that's going to be our DOE. And then we fully randomize it, and we run through. And with every 10 to 20 kgs of material, we're changing a condition. So 10 to 20 kgs is the amount of material I need to get to that new condition. I collect 1 kg of material. You end up actually only needing about 15 kgs of material to loop together per condition. So that's the way that you do development, is change something, and again, now we can start thinking about changing things differently than what we do nowadays. Like, for instance, change your material density. Something that, to my knowledge, we don't usually do, especially in commercial cell manufacturing, is change material properties, let them flow through and see what happens out of this. But we could do this now in a very material efficient manner. Now the reverse becomes true in manufacturing. When you're in manufacturing, if you see this change come through with your continuous manufacturing monitoring, with all your information that you're getting there, then what you can do is you can adjust the process in real time to keep your product on track. Again, going back to the donuts, they're coming out a little too soft, turn up the temperature in the fryer. Okay, so I'm going to go back through the 3 things we talked about, the 3 advantages of this technology. So the outcome, high value API, due to, high value for API is ideal for this because it's inherent value. If you're talking about somewhere, well, I'll go over in a little more detail. Fast-track drug products are really good because of the speed that you can do development, and drug product will likely segregate, such as micronized products are also very good. So back into the advantages here. So being able to run the process as a dynamic experimental device means that what we could do is tune our line and run our line at an optimal continuous manufacturing rate, so that we get a minimum amount of material waste between different operating conditions. And what that really means is, again, minimum amount of material being used for understanding the process. Okay, second one, and this goes to the manufacturing side, is that once you go into manufacturing, how big is a continuous manufacturing line? So ours is targeted to run 15 to 50 kgs an hour, because that's about as small as you can run and still get robust product performance. So what does that mean? Well, what you got here is a line of number of batches at different scales versus continuous production rate, yearly quantities. So if I turn on a 15 kg an hour line and I run it for 10 30-day campaigns and I amass all that material, how many batches do I have to run to equal that much material? Well, it's about 200 batches of 600 kg of a 600 kg batch train, and about 300 batches and about 400 batches of a 300 kg batch train. So even at the low end, at 15 kgs an hour, this is a full-scale manufacturing suite that's online with an entire 300 or 600 kg train. If we look at the high end of our production rate, which our rate will be somewhere in there, it becomes a real powerhouse. I mean, that's when we're talking about being able to go 600 kg batches in a year, or it's about 1,200 300 kg batches in a year. All right, so I went back in the beginning, I pointed out this cost of development and the high value APIs. Well, here we go again. If we're still going to use probably a similar amount of material in R&D, still need to do those small scale studies. Pilot scale, now we're getting to this 300 kgs. That's your pilot study. That's where you're going to do your experiments. You're going to do 15 experiments across 20 data points, 15 kgs per experiment. That's where you're going to get the same amount of material, so you're still going to have to spend that money. But then at that point, you've characterized a full-bore continuous manufacturing process. You characterize a large-scale process. You don't have to go and scale up after that. So all of this material that we put into scale up, which we eventually end up just landfilling because it's not fit for consumption because it was a scale up process, this is where the savings is going to be in the back end with your valuable APIs. My assumptions going into this were 20% of the total weight, the API was 20% of the total weight, and it was worth about $10,000 per kilogram, which means your product was worth about $2,000 per kilogram. These are kind of nominal numbers. They're not too high, not too low as far as the industry goes. Segregation. Talked about how the continuous nature of segregation really helps out with how the continuous nature of the process is much more robust in the face of segregating compounds. If you think about that same picture, what we're really doing now is you go through startup, you get your small molecule, small particles get in a train, they hit a steady state. We hit that steady state, we just keep running. You don't stop, you don't come out of it, you don't hit this dynamic state at the end until shutdown. So this becomes startup, steady state, and shutdown. But this steady state could go on for days or weeks if we need to. And that means that segregating compounds really just don't have anywhere to hide. They don't have anywhere to get caught up. And this means that things that are highly segregating, you can actually put through a continuous direct compression line with no negative issues. That doesn't mean that segregation isn't happening. It actually very much is. And we've seen this in a couple studies, at least the hints of this, where just like anybody who's ever cracked open a Guinness and poured it, you see on the outside of a Guinness, you see bubbles going down, which is a really strange thing. That's because on the inside in the middle, there's big bubbles coming up. The small bubbles getting trained, they get taken by the fast flow and pulled back down around by the water, and so you only see the small ones. Same things happen in these pipes, and you can have something like large particles in the middle, smaller particles on the outside, and smallest on the outside. So it's something we do think about. We worry about it when it comes to sensing and stuff like that, but it doesn't affect your product quality as it's coming out the other end. So that's the end of the talk. If anybody's got any questions, I'm here to answer.